You're going to hate me for telling you this, but women need men more than men need women. A man could be single at 45 years old and gain options, but a woman can be single at 45 and she negotiates with regret. Men age into leverage. Women age into reality. That's the difference. A man can create life at 25 years old or 65. Time works for him. It hunts her though. When beauty expires, hierarchy becomes visible. Men were never optional. We are the roads. We're the power grid. We're the load-bearing beams of civilization. Remove men and nothing runs on time. Every plane on the planet would be late if women ran the airports. Women need men way more than they're ever going to dare telling you.
Something fundamental has shifted in the world of dating, relationships, and family, and most people are still pretending it has not happened. What we are witnessing is not a phase, not a trend, and not a temporary protest. It is a long-term behavioral change driven by years of lived experience. And once you understand what caused it, there is no putting the pieces back together. Stay with me until the end of this video, because what I'm about to lay out explains why so many people feel confused, angry, and unprepared for the future that is already here. Before we get into it, make sure you like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear this, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell and select all so you get every single Angry Guy video the moment we release it. This helps the channel more than you might think, and it ensures you do not miss what is coming next. Also, take a moment to check out Angry's Crypto Academy, which is linked in the description below. If you want to learn how to protect and safeguard your assets, grow your wealth, and understand how to buy, sell, and trade crypto responsibly in an uncertain world, the Academy is built specifically for that. The link is in the description, so go check it out now. And if you're enjoying these Angry Guy videos and want to show support for the work that goes into them, you can buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description. It is a simple way to help keep the lights on and the content flowing. Now let us get into it. For decades, men were told a very specific story about their place in the world. They were told who they were allowed to be, how they were allowed to behave, and what was expected of them in relationships. Or more importantly, they were repeatedly told who they were not needed by. The message was not subtle. It was loud, constant, and reinforced across media, education, entertainment, and social spaces. Men were told to step back, to stay quiet, to stop approaching, to stop leading, to stop initiating, and to stop assuming they had a role to play. At first, many men tried to adapt. They adjusted their behavior, softened their tone, questioned themselves, and attempted to meet expectations that were constantly changing. They were told that if they just listened more, gave more, and asked for less, things would improve. But the goalposts kept moving, and eventually something important happened. Men stopped arguing, stopped negotiating, and stopped trying to prove anything. They simply listened, accepted the message at face value, and walked away. That moment does not get enough attention. Men did not leave in anger. They did not leave in protest. They left quietly. They left without announcements, without rallies, and without demands. They left because they were told repeatedly and clearly that their presence was unnecessary and unwanted. When someone tells you for years that you are the problem, eventually you believe them, and belief changes behavior. What happened next surprised a lot of people. Once men stepped away from dating and relationships, many of them did not fall apart. They did not spiral. They did not collapse into loneliness. Instead, many experienced something they had not felt in a long time, which was peace. Not excitement, not chaos, not constant emotional tension, but quiet stability. They discovered that being alone is not the same thing as feeling alone, and that realization changes everything. Men began to notice how much time, energy, and money they had been pouring into systems that did not give much back. They noticed how often they were expected to show up, pay up, and stay silent while being criticized for doing so. They noticed how rarely their needs were acknowledged unless those needs aligned with someone else's expectations. And once they noticed, they could not unsee it. This is where the denial begins on the other side. Many women still believe that the old dynamics are intact, that men will return once conditions improve or once pressure is applied. There is a persistent belief that leverage still exists, that the absence of men is temporary, and that eventually men will come back to restore balance. But leverage only works when the other party still wants what you are offering. What happens when they no longer do? Men walking away is not about punishment or revenge. It is about pattern recognition. Men watched what happened to other men. They watched the outcomes of relationships that began with optimism and ended with exhaustion. They watched friends lose time, resources, and stability. They watched the rules change mid-game. Over time, they stopped listening to promises and started trusting observable reality. A major shift occurred when men began to prioritize predictability over excitement. Predictability does not make headlines, but it makes life manageable. Men realized that they could structure their lives around simplicity, routine, and self directed goals. They could focus on work, health, hobbies, and financial stability without the constant pressure to perform or prove. This is not isolation. This is intentional withdrawal from unnecessary friction. Minimalism plays a bigger role here than people realize. Men are often naturally minimalist. When they remove what drains them, they do not feel like they are missing something. They feel lighter. A simpler life with fewer obligations can feel like luxury when compared to constant emotional turbulence. Comfort does not always come from excess. Sometimes it comes from subtraction. As this shift unfolded, economic reality added fuel to the fire. Living costs rose. Housing became more expensive. Daily expenses increased. In previous generations, men were expected to act as buffers between reality and everyone else. They absorbed financial pressure, worked longer hours, and took on responsibility as a default role. But that role was also criticized, diminished, and reframed as unnecessary. Eventually, men stopped volunteering for it. Now we see the consequences playing out in real time. More women are openly discussing financial stress, rising costs, and the difficulty of maintaining independence. Many express confusion about why support is no longer flowing the way it once did. But support is not automatic. It emerges from mutual investment. When one side disengages emotionally and socially, the economic effects follow. And another overlooked factor is how public space has changed. Men were told that normal behavior could be interpreted negatively, that being noticed could be framed as inappropriate, and that misunderstanding carried consequences. When risk increases and reward decreases, rational people opt out. This is not fear, this is calculation. Men decided that avoidance was safer than participation. Technology accelerated everything. Social platforms turned private interactions into public spectacles. Mistakes became permanent records. Context disappeared. Trust eroded. Men adapted by reducing exposure. They stopped initiating, stopped engaging, and stopped placing themselves in situations where misunderstanding could escalate. Silence became a form of self protection. As men stepped back, many found fulfillment elsewhere. They invested in skills, fitness, financial literacy, and personal projects. They built routines that did not rely on external validation. They learned to enjoy their own company. Over time, they realized that the narrative telling them they would be miserable alone was simply not accurate. This is deeply uncomfortable for people who built expectations around male participation. Denial often sounds like confidence. It insists that things will return to normal without acknowledging why they changed. It dismisses men's experiences as temporary confusion rather than permanent learning. But once someone learns that peace is possible without constant compromise, it is very hard to convince them to give it up. Men walking away are not waiting to be called back. They are not watching from the sidelines, hoping for permission to return. They are building lives that do not depend on approval. They are choosing rest over struggle, clarity over chaos, and autonomy over obligation. That is not collapse, that is adaptation. The story being told publicly often skips this part. It focuses on surface level frustration, without addressing the deeper cause. It asks why men are not showing up without acknowledging how often they were told not to. It demands participation without offering trust. It assumes desire without offering stability. That disconnect grows wider every year. There is also an emotional component that deserves attention. Many men spent years feeling misunderstood, mischaracterized, or dismissed. When those feelings accumulate, they do not explode outward, they turn inward. Men become quieter, more reserved, less willing to explain themselves. This is not bitterness, it is disengagement. Once disengagement sets in, reversing it is incredibly difficult. You cannot demand enthusiasm from someone who has already made peace with absence. You cannot pressure someone into desire. Tough times are here. The 9 to 5 is history, and the creator economy is taking over. Join Angry's Creator Academy to learn how to build a thriving online business from scratch with minimal investment. Ditch the daily grind and flourish while others falter. Plus, sign up now and get our online business blueprint free. The Academy is linked in the description below. Go check it out now. You cannot shame someone into participation. Those tactics only reinforce the decision to stay away. What we are seeing now is not the beginning of a crisis. It is the result of long-term messaging colliding with reality. People are experiencing the outcome of choices made over decades. Some are adapting quickly, others are still negotiating with the past. Men who have walked away are not antisocial or disconnected from reality. They are highly aware of it. They observe patterns, they weigh costs, they adjust behavior accordingly. They are not rejecting relationships out of spite. They are declining contracts that no longer make sense. This does not mean relationships are impossible. It means they are no longer automatic. They require mutual respect, predictability, and shared effort. The era of assumed participation is over. The era of intentional choice has begun. And this is where the conversation needs to go, but rarely does. Instead of asking why men are gone, the better question is what would make staying worthwhile again? That answer cannot come from demands or nostalgia. It has to come from reality as it exists now, not as it once was imagined to be. As we move forward, the gap between expectation and behavior will continue to widen unless people confront uncomfortable truths. Denial delays adaptation. Acceptance accelerates it. The men who walked away did not disappear. They simply chose a different path, one that prioritized peace over performance. And that brings us to where we are today, with two groups looking at the same world and interpreting it very differently. One side is waiting for a return that is not coming. The other is already gone, quietly building something else. To understand where this is heading, you have to step back and look at how social systems react when one side quietly exits. When participation drops, the system does not immediately collapse. At first, it compensates. Expectations adjust. Language changes. New explanations are offered. But when the absence becomes permanent, compensation fails, and reality asserts itself. That is the stage we are entering now. For a long time, society relied on men to absorb pressure without complaint. Men were expected to work longer hours, shoulder risk, and provide stability while being told that their contributions were either invisible or morally suspect. That contradiction could only exist as long as men believed participation was mandatory. Once they realized it was optional, the entire structure began to wobble. One of the most revealing aspects of this shift is how quietly it happened. There was no announcement that men were done dating, no single moment where the switch flipped. Instead, men simply stopped initiating. They stopped pursuing. They stopped volunteering. When asked why, many did not bother to explain because explanation had become exhausting. Silence became easier than debate. What replaced relationships for many men was not isolation, but focus. Focus on health, routines, financial discipline, and personal interests. Men began structuring their lives around what they could control rather than what they were expected to manage for others. That sense of control is powerful. It creates stability, and stability is addictive once you have lived without it. There's also a generational component that often gets overlooked. Younger men grew up watching older men struggle. They saw the outcomes, the stress, the imbalance, and the emotional toll. They learned vicariously. By the time they reached adulthood, many had already decided that the traditional path was not worth the risk. They did not need to experience it firsthand to understand the cost. This generational learning accelerated the trend. Men did not have to be burned personally to recognize danger. Pattern recognition filled in the gaps. When enough examples exist, rational people adjust to behavior. This is not bitterness, it is intelligence applied to lived data. Meanwhile, public narratives lag behind reality. Cultural messaging still assumes male participation as a given. Advice columns, social commentary, and media discussions often speak as though men are merely distracted or temporarily disengaged. They treat absence as confusion rather than intention. That misreading creates further disconnect. Another critical element is how trust eroded over time. Trust is not destroyed in dramatic moments, it erodes through inconsistency, through double standards, through being told one thing and experiencing another. Men were told that vulnerability would be rewarded, but often found it used against them. They were told communication was key, but discovered that only certain feelings were acceptable. Over time, silence became safer than honesty. Once trust is gone, incentives matter more than promises. Men began evaluating relationships the way they evaluate any other long term commitment. What is the cost? What is the return? What are the risks? When those calculations consistently pointed toward loss, disengagement became logical. There is also a misconception that men walking away are unhappy or resentful. That assumption says more about the observer than the subject. Many men report feeling calmer, more grounded, and less anxious. They sleep better. They manage their time more effectively. They experience fewer emotional highs and lows, but also fewer crashes. Stability replaces drama. Drama is often mistaken for passion. Chaos is mistaken for connection. When men step away from that cycle, it can look like emptiness from the outside, but from the inside, it feels like relief. Once someone experiences relief, it is very difficult to convince them to return to tension. This shift also reveals how much of modern social life was built on unspoken expectations. Men were expected to initiate relationships, plan dates, absorb rejection, pay costs, and maintain momentum. When they stopped doing those things, the entire dynamic stalled. Many people interpreted that stall as male failure rather than structural dependency. What we are seeing now is the exposure of that dependency. When one side stops carrying weight, the imbalance becomes visible. That visibility is uncomfortable. It challenges assumptions about independence, strength, and self sufficiency. Denial becomes a coping mechanism. Denial often takes the form of confidence. It insists that nothing has changed, that standards remain high, that men will adjust. But confidence without leverage is just optimism. Leverage requires desire on the other side, and desire cannot be forced. Another important factor is that men did not replace relationships with something equally demanding. They replaced them with simplicity, fewer commitments, fewer expectations, fewer emotional negotiations. That simplicity creates space, space to think, space to rest, space to decide. Rest is a theme that deserves attention. Many men were exhausted, not physically, but emotionally. Constant self monitoring, constant adjustment, constant concern about saying the wrong thing. Walking away removed that mental load. Once the mind rests, Clarity follows. With clarity comes perspective. Men began to reevaluate narratives they had accepted without question. They asked why they were expected to sacrifice indefinitely. They questioned whether criticism was constructive or simply habitual. They recognized patterns of behavior that were normalized but unhealthy. This reevaluation did not happen overnight. It happened slowly, privately, and without public validation. Men did not seek approval for leaving, they did not need permission. They simply stopped showing up where they no longer felt welcome. Economic conditions reinforced this choice. Rising costs made risk less tolerable. When survival becomes more expensive, people become more selective about where they invest energy. Men prioritized self preservation. They focused on saving, planning, and stability rather than emotional speculation. Technology amplified everything. Online discussions allowed men to compare notes, not to organize, but to validate observations. When multiple people report the same experience independently, it confirms reality. That confirmation reduces doubt and strengthens resolve. This is why calls for men to return often fall flat. They address symptoms rather than causes. They appeal to nostalgia rather than current conditions. They assume desire without rebuilding trust. Without addressing why men left, invitations sound hollow. Another misunderstanding is the idea that men walking away are avoiding responsibility. In reality, many are redefining it: responsibility to self, responsibility to future stability, responsibility to mental health. These are not lesser responsibilities, they are foundational ones. There is also a broader societal implication. When large numbers of men disengage from traditional roles, institutions feel the strain. Fewer marriages, fewer children, fewer long term commitments. These trends are often discussed abstractly, but they are lived concretely by individuals making rational choices. Blame does not reverse trends, adaptation does. If systems want participation, they must offer value. If relationships want investment, they must offer predictability and respect. Expectation alone is not currency. One of the most striking elements of this shift is how little men talk about it publicly. They do not need slogans, they do not need validation campaigns. They simply live differently. That quietness is often misinterpreted as weakness, but it is the opposite. It is confidence without performance, and confidence without performance is threatening to systems built on constant signaling. When men stop signaling, stop proving, stop justifying, the noise level drops. What remains is reality. Reality shows that many men are content without constant romantic pursuit. It shows that fulfillment can come from structure, purpose, and autonomy. It shows that happiness does not require approval. This realization challenges deeply ingrained narratives. It suggests that men were not incomplete without relationships, but rather overextended. It suggests that what was framed as loneliness was often exhaustion. As denial fades, some will adapt. They will reassess expectations, they will rebuild trust, they will engage differently. Others will cling to outdated assumptions and grow increasingly frustrated. That divergence will shape the social landscape for years to come. The men who walked away are not waiting to be convinced. They are watching outcomes. They are observing behavior. They are assessing whether conditions have genuinely changed. Words will not move them. Only consistency will. This is the hard truth many do not want to face. Once people learn through experience, they stop responding to rhetoric. They respond to patterns. And patterns take time to change. As we move forward, the question is not whether men will return, but whether society will adapt to their absence, whether new models of connection will emerge, whether expectations will reset. What is clear is that the old assumptions no longer hold. Participation is no longer automatic. Roles are no longer guaranteed. Engagement must be earned. At this stage, the most important thing to understand is that this shift is not being driven by ideology. It is being driven by lived experience. Ideologies can be argued against, reframed, or replaced. Experience cannot. When enough people independently arrive at the same conclusion through observation, that conclusion becomes durable. This is why attempts to dismiss men walking away as a temporary reaction consistently fail. Temporary reactions fade. Learned behavior does not. Men reached a point where effort no longer felt proportional to outcome. That realization alone changes everything. Human beings will tolerate a great deal of difficulty if the reward feels meaningful and the rules feel stable. What men encountered instead was unpredictability paired with criticism. Over time, that combination teaches withdrawal, not out of fear, but out of efficiency. Efficiency is a word that rarely appears in discussions about relationships, yet it explains much of what is happening. Men began asking themselves whether the emotional and financial investment required was producing a return that justified the cost. When the answer was consistently no, disengagement followed. This is not cold calculation. It is survival logic applied to modern conditions. One of the most misunderstood aspects of this change is how it affects men internally. Contrary to popular narratives, many men did not feel loss when they stepped away. They felt relief. Relief from expectation, relief from judgment, relief from constant evaluation. That relief created mental space, and mental space allowed men to rediscover parts of themselves that had been suppressed. With that rediscovery came self respect. Self respect does not demand attention, it does not seek validation, it does not argue its worth. It simply refuses situations that undermine it. Once self respect takes root, persuasion becomes ineffective. You cannot talk someone out of peace once they have found it. Another factor accelerating the shift is how openly contradictions became visible. Men were told they were unnecessary while simultaneously being blamed for absence. They were told independence was strength while being criticized for not providing. These mixed messages created cognitive dissonance, and cognitive dissonance forces resolution. The resolution men chose was consistency. If they were not needed, they stopped acting needed. Consistency is deeply undervalued in modern discourse. It is not dramatic, it does not trend, but it stabilizes behavior. Men walking away chose the most consistent response to decades of messaging. They aligned their actions with what they were told, not with what was later demanded. This alignment also exposed how much emotional labor men had been performing without recognition. Men were expected to manage their own emotions while also buffering the emotions of others. They were expected to remain calm, patient, and understanding regardless of circumstance. When that labor was withdrawn, its absence became noticeable. Yet, instead of acknowledging that labor, many discussions frame male withdrawal as abandonment. That framing avoids responsibility. It avoids asking why men felt the need to leave. It shifts focus away from systemic patterns and onto individual blame. Blame, however, does not restore participation. It accelerates disengagement. Men also noticed how often accountability flowed in one direction. Expectations were rigid, but responsibility was flexible. Standards were enforced selectively. Over time, men learned that the safest position was the one with the fewest obligations. Safety became more valuable than approval. This shift is not about rejecting connection, it is about rejecting asymmetry. Men are not opposed to partnership. They are opposed to instability disguised as progress. They are opposed to being held to standards that are not reciprocated. When reciprocity disappears, withdrawal becomes rational. Another layer to this change involves how masculinity itself was framed. Men were encouraged to soften, adjust, and reconfigure themselves, often without clarity about what was acceptable in return. Boundaries were criticized as insecurity. Assertiveness was reframed as aggression. Confidence was treated as arrogance. In that environment, withdrawal became the only uncontested choice. Men who walked away did not become less masculine. They became more selective. They stopped performing masculinity for approval and started living it privately. That shift reduced conflict because it removed the audience. Living without an audience changes behavior profoundly. When no one is watching, people act in alignment with their values rather than expectations. Men discovered that much of the pressure they felt came from being observed, evaluated, and interpreted. Removing that pressure restored equilibrium. Equilibrium is the key word here. Men were not seeking dominance or control. They were seeking balance. Balance between effort and reward. Balance between responsibility and respect. Balance between contribution and appreciation. When balance was consistently absent, disengagement restored it. This also explains why many men appear unbothered by criticism directed at them for leaving. Criticism loses power when the source no longer matters. Men who have opted out are not seeking approval from systems they no longer participate in. That detachment is often mistaken for apathy, but it is actually autonomy. And until autonomy changes priorities, it shifts focus inward. Men began asking what kind of life they wanted, not what kind of role they were supposed to fill. Many discovered that a quieter life aligned better with their temperament. They embraced routine, simplicity, and self direction. This is where the minimalist lifestyle becomes relevant again. Men reduced consumption, reduced social obligations, and reduced exposure to unnecessary stress. They learned that happiness does not require constant stimulation. It requires stability and purpose. Purpose, for many men, does not come from validation. It comes from mastery. Mastery of skills, finances, health, and time. These are areas where effort reliably produces results. Relationships, by contrast, had become unpredictable. Men gravitated toward what rewarded consistency. This gravitation was not coordinated. It did not require leadership or ideology. It emerged organically as men compared outcomes and adjusted behavior. That organic nature makes it resilient. Trends imposed from above can be reversed. Behaviors learned through experience cannot. Another element often ignored is how the shift affects communication itself. Men who walked away communicate less, not because they have nothing to say, but because they no longer feel the need to explain themselves. Explanation implies obligation. Silence implies completion. Silence also protects energy. Many men realized how much energy was consumed by constant justification. Once they stopped justifying, that energy became available for personal growth. That growth reinforced the decision to disengage. As men grew more self sufficient, the narrative that they needed external approval weakened. They proved to themselves that they could thrive without constant affirmation. That proof mattered more than any argument. This creates a difficult reality for those who expected male participation as a given. Expectations built on outdated assumptions lead to frustration. Frustration leads to denial. Denial delays adaptation, and delay compounds consequences. What we are witnessing now is not a standoff, it is a divergence. Two paths moving in different directions. One path clings to past dynamics, the other builds new ones quietly. And the men on the second path are not hostile, they are indifferent. Indifference is far more powerful than opposition. Opposition engages, indifference ignores. Systems cannot function without engagement. This is why attempts to shame men back into participation fail. Shame requires shared values. Once values diverge, shame loses leverage. Men walking away are not rejecting morality, they are redefining it around self respect and sustainability. Sustainability is the overlooked word in this entire discussion. Men asked whether the traditional model was sustainable for them. Many concluded it was not. Sustainability does not mean ease, it means endurance. A system that drains faster than it replenishes cannot last. By stepping away, men preserve themselves. Preservation is not selfish, it is necessary. A depleted person cannot contribute meaningfully to anything. Men recognized that and acted accordingly. This recognition is spreading. Younger men observe older men who walked away and see stability rather than regret. That observation reinforces the trend. When outcomes validate behavior, imitation follows. Cultural narratives cannot override observable success, and if men who disengage appear calmer, healthier, and more stable, others will follow regardless of messaging. Reality outperforms rhetoric every time. As this continues, the social landscape will keep shifting. Institutions built on assumptions of male participation will need to adapt or contract. Relationships will become fewer but more intentional. Expectations will either reset or break. The uncomfortable truth is that no one is entitled to someone else's effort. Participation must be voluntary to be meaningful. Men have made their choice clear through behavior rather than words. When people finally begin to accept that something has changed, the next instinct is often to look for a villain. That instinct is understandable, but it is also misleading. What is happening now is not the result of a single group acting with intent. It is the outcome of incentives, messaging, and lived reality interacting over time. When enough people respond to the same pressures in the same way, behavior shifts collectively without coordination. Men walking away is one of those shifts. It did not require organization, leadership, or ideology. It required repetition. Repetition of experiences that taught men the same lesson over and over again. When the lesson became clear, behavior followed. A crucial point that is often missed is that men did not walk away from women as individuals. They walked away from systems, expectations, and roles that no longer made sense. Individual relationships still happen, genuine connections still exist, but the default assumption that men will pursue, provide, and persist regardless of outcome is gone. That assumption was never written down. It was implied. It lived in social norms, cultural scripts, and unspoken rules. Once men stopped following those scripts, the silence exposed how dependent the system had been on their participation. Another reason denial persists is because admitting this shift forces uncomfortable self reflection. It requires asking whether past behavior contributed to present outcomes. That is not an easy question for any group to face. It is far easier to insist that nothing has really changed and that things will return to normal if pressure is applied. But pressure only works when the pressured party cares about the approval of the one applying it. Men who have walked away no longer seek that approval. They are not trying to win arguments, they are trying to preserve equilibrium. Equilibrium is not dramatic. It does not create viral moments. It does not fuel endless discussion. It simply feels better. And people protect what feels better. One of the clearest indicators that this shift is permanent is how men talk about the future. They are not expressing longing for what they left behind. They are making plans that do not include traditional milestones. They are budgeting differently, living differently, measuring success differently. Success for many men now means autonomy. It means controlling their time, their finances, and their emotional exposure. It means fewer dependencies and fewer variables they cannot manage. That definition of success is incompatible with systems that rely on sacrifice without reciprocity. This redefinition of success also changes how men relate to society at large. They participate where participation makes sense. They disengage where it does not. They stop trying to fix systems that do not reward fixing. They conserve energy. Energy conservation is not apathy, it is strategic restraint. Men learned that constant engagement drained them without improving outcomes. Once they recognized that pattern, stepping back became the logical move. The reaction to this restraint often reveals more than the restraint itself. When people respond with anger, accusation, or disbelief, it signals expectation without consent. It signals a belief that participation is owed. That belief cannot survive in a world where people are increasingly aware of choice. Choice is the central theme here. Men realized they had it. For a long time, many believed they did not. They believed roles were fixed, paths were predetermined, and deviation was failure. Once that belief collapsed, behavior followed. This collapse did not lead to chaos for men. It led to clarity. Clarity about what they value, clarity about what they will tolerate, clarity about where they invest. That clarity is why attempts to lure men back using guilt, nostalgia, or obligation do not work. Those tools belong to a time when men doubted their options. That doubt is gone. Another layer of this shift involves how men process conflict. Previously, conflict was often unavoidable because engagement was expected. Men argued, negotiated, and compromised because leaving was framed as failure. Now, leaving is framed as self respect. That reframing changes everything. When leaving is acceptable, conflict decreases. Men no longer argue over outcomes they cannot control. They simply exit situations that do not serve them. That exit is peaceful, not hostile. Peaceful exits are frustrating to systems that depend on emotional engagement. Anger can be managed, debate can be prolonged, silence cannot be negotiated with. Silence signals completion. It signals that the decision has already been made. That is why it unsettles people. Another misunderstood aspect of the shift is that men did not become colder. They became more selective. They reserve emotional investment for environments where it is safe and appreciated. That selectivity is not cruelty, it is discernment. Discernment develops through experience. It cannot be taught through slogans. Men gained it by observing outcomes over time. That observation sharpened their judgment. Judgment, once sharpened, is difficult to dull again. Men now recognize warning signs earlier. They identify patterns faster. They disengage sooner. This reduces emotional damage and reinforces the habit of withdrawal. Critics often misinterpret this as avoidance. In reality, it is optimization. Men optimize their lives around predictability and control. They chose environments where effort reliably produces results. This optimization extends beyond relationships. It affects careers, social circles, and lifestyle choices. Men gravitate toward roles where expectations are clear and rules are stable. They avoid ambiguity disguised as growth. Ambiguity requires constant negotiation. Negotiation requires emotional labor. Men decided that labor was too costly without guaranteed return. This decision has ripple effects. Fewer men volunteering for leadership roles, fewer men initiating social structures, fewer men stepping into undefined responsibilities. That absence creates gaps. Those gaps are often filled with confusion rather than solutions. Instead of asking why men step back, many discussions focus on how to force them forward. That approach fails because it ignores agency. Agency is the core issue. Men exercised it. Once exercised, it cannot be unexercised. You cannot convince someone they have no choice after they have used it. The long-term consequence of this is a cultural reset. Old scripts lose relevance. New norms emerge. Relationships become more intentional and less frequent. Commitment becomes rarer, but more deliberate. This is not a moral judgment, it is an observation. Systems evolve based on participation. When participation changes, systems adapt or decline. Another reason this shift feels destabilizing is because it exposes how much emotional reassurance men were providing. Men were often the stabilizing presence, even when criticized for it. When that presence disappears, anxiety rises. Anxiety seeks explanation. Explanation seeks blame. But blame does not restore stability. Only adaptation does. Adaptation requires acknowledging reality without defensiveness. It requires accepting that past assumptions no longer apply. That acceptance is still in progress. In the meantime, men continue building lives that make sense to them. They invest in health, skills, and long term security. They create routines that reduce uncertainty. They choose solitude over volatility. Solitude, in this context, is not loneliness, it is controlled environment, it is predictability, it is peace. Peace is undervalued because it does not announce itself, it does not compete for attention. But once experienced, it becomes non negotiable. Men who have found peace are not eager to trade it for chaos, no matter how familiar that chaos once felt. Familiarity is not comfort. Men learn the difference. This learning process is irreversible. You cannot unlearn what peace feels like. You cannot be convinced that constant tension is normal once you have experienced calm. This is why the idea that men will simply return en masse is unrealistic. Some will form relationships, some will choose partnership, but it will be on new terms, not old assumptions. Those terms will prioritize clarity, reciprocity, and stability. Anything less will be declined quietly. As this continues, cultural conversations will lag behind behavior. That lag creates confusion. People argue about causes while effects compound. The men who walked away are not waiting for those arguments to conclude, they are living their lives. When participation becomes optional rather than assumed, identity itself begins to shift. For a long time, men were defined by what they did for others: provider, protector, fixer, buffer. Those labels carried expectations, and expectations shaped behavior. Once men stepped away from those roles, many discovered something unsettling at first and liberating soon after. Without the role, they still existed. Without the obligation, they still mattered. That realization reshaped how men saw themselves. Identity stopped being external and became internal. Instead of asking what they were supposed to be, men asked what they actually wanted. That question is deceptively simple, yet it had rarely been encouraged. When men finally allowed themselves to ask it honestly, many answers pointed away from traditional scripts. This shift created a quiet separation between those who still define worth through social roles and those who define it through personal alignment. Men walking away moved toward alignment. They evaluated whether their daily actions matched their values. When they did not, change followed. Alignment produces calm. Calm sharpens judgment. Judgment reduces tolerance for dysfunction. This chain reaction explains why men who step away rarely return unchanged. They may re enter certain spaces, but they do so cautiously and selectively. They do not surrender the clarity they gained. Another aspect that deserves attention is how men recalibrated their emotional thresholds. Previously, many men endured discomfort because they believed endurance was virtuous. They tolerated stress, confusion, and imbalance because they believed resilience meant persistence. Over time, they learned a different lesson. Resilience also means knowing when to stop. Stopping does not mean quitting life, it means quitting cycles that do not improve. Men recognized patterns that repeated regardless of effort. Once repetition without progress became obvious, disengagement became an act of intelligence rather than weakness. Like, this reframing is critical. Men did not abandon responsibility, they redefined it. Responsibility shifted from maintaining appearances to maintaining well being. That shift changed priorities overnight. With new priorities came new communities. Men began gravitating toward spaces that valued competence, honesty, and boundaries. These spaces were often quieter, smaller, and less performative. They focused on skills, shared interests, and mutual respect rather than validation. These communities reinforced the walking away mindset without ever naming it. No manifesto was required. Behavior alone communicated the message. Show up where effort is respected. Leave where it is exploited. This behavioral filtering had a compounding effect. As more men adopted it, environments that depended on male overextension began to hollow out. Participation declined, engagement dropped, systems built on assumption faced reality. Reality does not negotiate, it reveals. One reason this transition feels unsettling is because it exposes how many interactions were sustained by pressure rather than desire. When pressure disappears, desire must stand on its own. In many cases, it did not. This realization is uncomfortable because it challenges narratives of empowerment that relied on guaranteed male attention. Attention is not empowerment when it is assumed, it is entitlement. Once entitlement is removed, genuine empowerment must replace it. Genuine empowerment requires self sufficiency, it requires accountability, it requires adaptation. These are demanding qualities and they cannot be outsourced. Men walking away unintentionally forced that reckoning. By removing themselves, they removed the buffer that absorbed consequences. Without that buffer, reality becomes unavoidable. This is why financial stress, emotional strain, and instability are being discussed more openly now. The safety net many took for granted has thinned. That net was not magical. It was built on labor, tolerance, and sacrifice that is no longer freely offered. Another overlooked consequence is how this shift affects conflict resolution. When one side disengages, the other can no longer rely on negotiation through pressure. Solutions must come from within rather than from extraction. That demands growth. Growth is difficult. It requires confronting uncomfortable truths. It requires acknowledging that certain strategies no longer work. Denial delays this process, but it cannot stop it. As denial fades, some will adapt. They will develop independence that does not rely on external validation. They will build stability without expectation of rescue. Others will remain stuck, waiting for conditions that no longer exist. Waiting is costly. Time does not pause while people hope for reversals. Men walking away understand this deeply. They no longer wait for permission or improvement. They act within their control. Control is the central attraction here. Men regained it. Not control over others, but control over themselves. That distinction matters. Control over self reduces anxiety. Reduced anxiety improves decision making. Improved decision making reinforces autonomy. The cycle feeds itself. This cycle is why men appear increasingly unresponsive to emotional appeals. Appeals are external. Autonomy is internal. Once internal stability is established, external pressure loses influence. This does not mean men lack empathy. It means empathy no longer overrides self preservation. Men learned that empathy without boundaries leads to depletion. Boundaries without empathy lead to isolation. The balance lies in selective engagement. Selective engagement defines the new landscape that to know men choose where to invest. They decline where returns are uncertain. They disengage without hostility. They move on. This movement creates a social gap. Fewer men participating in dating markets. Fewer men committing to long term arrangements. Fewer men assuming provider roles by default. The gap is not ideological, it is practical. Practical decisions scale quickly. When individuals independently choose the same path, trends emerge. These trends then get labeled, debated, and politicized. But the behavior preceded the label. This distinction matters because labels can be attacked. Behavior cannot. Men walking away do not need agreement to continue. They only need outcomes that reinforce their choice. So far, those outcomes exist. Another important element is How men now perceive risk. Risk tolerance decreases when consequences feel unfair or disproportionate. Men recalibrated their risk assessment. They decided that certain risks were no longer acceptable. This recalibration affects everything from relationships to career choices. Men favor predictability over prestige, stability over excitement, long term viability over short term validation. These preferences are not signs of fear, they are signs of maturity shaped by experience. Youth chases novelty, experience values reliability. As this mindset spreads, cultural expectations lag further behind reality. Advice rooted in old assumptions fails to resonate. Guidance that ignores lived outcomes feels hollow. Men notice this disconnect. It reinforces their decision to rely on observation rather than instruction. They trust what they see more than what they are told. Trust in observation over narrative is a defining trait of this era. It applies beyond relationships, it applies to institutions, media, and authority figures. Once trust erodes, behavior changes permanently. This erosion did not happen overnight. It accumulated through inconsistency and contradiction. Men walking away are not reacting to a single event. They are responding to decades of misalignment. Understanding this is crucial for anyone trying to make sense of what comes next. You cannot rewind trust. You can only rebuild it through consistent action over time. Rebuilding trust requires humility. It requires acknowledging mistakes without defensiveness. It requires changing behavior rather than language. These are difficult steps, but they are the only ones that work. Whether society takes them remains to be seen. What is clear is that men who have stepped away are not waiting for apologies or recognition. They are waiting for evidence. Evidence that conditions have genuinely changed. Evidence that stability is possible. Evidence that reciprocity exists. Until that evidence appears consistently, disengagement remains the rational choice. And this brings us to a critical turning point. As more men opt out, systems must either adapt or contract. There is no third option. Ignoring the shift does not reverse it. Shaming it does not stop it. Adaptation requires redesign. Redesign requires honesty. Honesty requires abandoning comforting myths. One of those myths is that men will always return because they always have. History does not guarantee the future. Conditions change, behavior follows. Another myth is that dissatisfaction equals hatred. Men walking away are not driven by hatred, they are driven by clarity. Clarity removes the need for hostility. Hostility consumes energy. Men are conserving it. This conservation explains why many men appear disengaged from social debates. They are not uninterested. They are uninterested in unproductive discussion. They focus on outcomes. Outcomes favor simplicity. They favor boundaries. They favor autonomy. And as this continues, a quieter, more self-directed male culture will solidify. It will not seek approval. It will not seek dominance. It will seek sustainability. Sustainability is the theme that ties everything together. Sustainable effort, sustainable relationships, sustainable expectations. Men refuse to participate in systems that were unsustainable for them. That refusal is not loud. It does not march. It does not protest. It simply withdraws. Withdrawal is powerful because it reveals dependency. When something stops working without constant input, its fragility is exposed. We are watching that exposure now. As fewer people follow traditional life paths, society begins to experience a kind of quiet fragmentation, not a dramatic collapse, but a gradual thinning, fewer shared milestones, fewer predictable timelines, fewer assumptions that everyone is moving in the same direction. This fragmentation creates confusion because systems were built around expectation rather than choice. When choice replaces expectation, coordination becomes harder. Men walking away contribute to this fragmentation not through rebellion, but through non participation. They are not trying to disrupt systems, they are simply no longer sustaining them. This distinction matters. Disruption invites response, absence forces adjustment. Adjustment is uncomfortable because it requires change without an obvious opponent. You cannot argue with someone who is no longer in the room. You cannot negotiate with silence. You must instead reevaluate structure. Structure for a long time relied on male compliance. Men complied because they believed compliance was honorable. They believed sacrifice was noble. They believed endurance was strength. Over time, those beliefs were challenged by outcomes that did not align with effort. When belief and outcome diverge long enough, belief collapses. What replaces it is pragmatism. Pragmatism is not cynical. It is grounded. It asks simple questions. Does this work? Does this last? Does this cost more than it gives? Men began asking those questions without guilt. Guilt had been a powerful motivator. Men were taught to feel guilty for prioritizing themselves. They were told self-focus was selfish. But as life became more demanding and support became conditional, guilt lost its power. Survival does not negotiate with shame. This shift away from guilt allowed men to reclaim time. Time is the most valuable resource because it cannot be replenished. Men became protective of it. They stopped spending it where returns were unclear. Time protection changed daily habits. Men reduced social obligations. They simplified routines. They focused on physical health and mental clarity. These changes compounded. A clearer mind leads to better decisions. Better decisions lead to better outcomes, and better outcomes validate the behavior that produced them. This is how walking away became self-reinforcing. As this self-reinforcement spread, cultural tension increased. Systems that relied on predictable male input began to strain, not immediately, but gradually. Participation dipped, engagement thinned, commitment delayed. Delayed commitment is often framed as immaturity, but that framing ignores context. Men are not delaying because they cannot commit. They are delaying because they understand the cost of committing poorly. Experience taught them that commitment without clarity is dangerous. Danger does not always mean dramatic loss. It often means slow erosion, erosion of peace, erosion of stability, erosion of self-respect. Men recognized erosion patterns early and stepped back before damage accumulated. This recognition required emotional literacy that is rarely acknowledged. Men learned to identify stress signals. They learned to listen to discomfort. They learned to exit before resentment formed. Resentment forms when people feel trapped. Walking away prevented that trap. It preserved emotional neutrality. Neutrality is often mistaken for coldness. In reality, it is balance. Balanced people do not overreact. They do not argue endlessly. They do not chase validation. They simply choose environments that match their needs. This choice-based living contrasts sharply with obligation-based living. Obligation assumes permanence. Choice assumes evaluation. Men shifted from obligation to evaluation. Evaluation requires standards. Men develop standards not for others, but for themselves. They asked what kind of life they wanted to live and what conditions supported it. These standards were not rigid. They were practical. Predictability mattered. Respect mattered. Peace mattered. Peace became non-negotiable. This is why many men now appear unwilling to compromise on foundational issues. Compromise without stability feels like regression. Once peace is established, anything that threatens it is scrutinized. This scrutiny extends to emotional dynamics. Men became more aware of cycles that created tension without resolution. They learned to disengage from circular arguments. They recognized when communication served expression rather than solution. This recognition changed how men approached conversation itself. They spoke less but more intentionally. They avoided debates that went nowhere. They conserved emotional energy. Emotional conservation is a survival skill in environments that demand constant responsiveness. Men developed it quietly. As men conserved energy, productivity improved, focus sharpened, health stabilized. These improvements contradicted narratives that men would suffer without traditional structures. Contradictions undermine ideology. When predicted misery does not appear, credibility erodes. This erosion created a gap between what people expected to see and what they observed. Men were not collapsing, they were recalibrating. That recalibration unsettled those who believed male fulfillment required external validation. Validation is powerful only when internal alignment is missing. Once alignment exists, validation becomes optional. Men walking away found alignment through autonomy. They controlled their schedules, they controlled their finances, they controlled their exposure. That control reduced stress, improved mood. Improved mood, improved interactions. Men were not angry, they were calm. Calm men are difficult to manipulate. They are also difficult to provoke. Provocation relies on emotional hooks. Calmness removes them. This removal explains why certain narratives no longer gain traction. Appeals to guilt, duty, or nostalgia fail when emotional leverage is gone. Leverage always depends on dependency. Men reduced dependency. That reduction shifted power dynamics quietly but decisively. Power here does not mean dominance, it means self direction, the ability to choose without fear of consequence. Fear had been a major factor in compliance. Fear of being labeled, fear of being misunderstood, fear of social isolation. Men faced those fears and found them manageable. Once fears are faced, they lose control. This loss of control is unsettling for systems that rely on fear based compliance. When fear fades, incentives must change. Many have not. Incentives rooted in assumption no longer work. Incentives must now align with value. Value is subjective, but patterns emerge. Men value predictability, they value respect, they value autonomy, they value peace. Any structure that undermines these values struggles to retain participation. As participation declines, narratives attempt to fill the gap. Explanations proliferate, labels multiply, but explanation does not reverse behavior. Behavior changes only when incentives change. This is why the future will not be shaped by debate, but by adaptation. Those who adapt to the new reality will build sustainable systems. Those who cling to old assumptions will struggle. Adaptation requires recognizing that men are not obligated to return. Participation must be earned through conditions that make sense. This is not a threat, it is a description. Descriptions can be uncomfortable because they remove illusion. Illusion provides comfort, reality demands adjustment. Men walking away forced reality into view. They did not do so intentionally. It was a byproduct of choosing self preservation. Self preservation is instinctive, it overrides social pressure when stakes rise. Rising costs, rising stress, and rising uncertainty sharpen instincts. Men responded by narrowing focus. They focused on what they could control, they ignored what they could not. This narrowing reduced overwhelm. Overwhelm clouds judgment. Clarity restores it. With clarity came long term thinking. Men planned for stability rather than excitement. They prepared for future uncertainty rather than present approval. Preparation is often invisible until crisis hits. Men walking away prepared quietly. As preparation spreads, cultural rhythms change. Fewer impulsive decisions, fewer rushed commitments, more deliberation. Deliberation slows systems built on momentum. That slowdown feels like stagnation to those expecting constant motion. But stagnation is not the same as recalibration. Recalibration pauses to adjust alignment. Men recalibrated their lives. That recalibration is ongoing. It affects how men relate to work. They pursue roles with clear boundaries. They avoid environments with undefined expectations. They prefer compensation that matches effort. This preference reinforces autonomy. Autonomy reinforces peace. Peace reinforces withdrawal from chaos. Chaos is addictive to some. It creates intensity. It creates engagement. But intensity without direction exhausts. Men chose direction. Direction does not require crowds. It requires purpose. Purpose does not require approval. It requires alignment. Alignment does not require explanation. It requires honesty. Men walking away practiced honesty with themselves first. That honesty led to decisions others did not expect. Unexpected behavior destabilizes assumptions. Destabilized assumptions create friction. Friction reveals dependency. We are watching that reveal unfold across multiple layers of society. As this transformation settles in, what replaces the old systems is not chaos, but selectivity. Community does not disappear. Intimacy does not vanish. Cooperation does not end. What disappears is obligation without consent. What fades is participation driven by pressure rather than desire. What remains is intentional engagement, and intentional engagement is always smaller, quieter, and more durable. Men walking away are not withdrawing from humanity. They are withdrawing from arrangements that no longer align with reality. This distinction is critical. Humans do not abandon connection. They abandon imbalance. They abandon unpredictability. They abandon roles that demand sacrifice without stability. What emerges instead is a new form of community, one that is less centralized and more fragmented, but also more honest. Men form bonds around shared purpose rather than shared expectation. They collaborate where trust exists and disengage where it does not. These communities are not loud, they are functional. Functionality matters more than visibility. A system that works quietly outperforms one that announces itself loudly. Men learned this lesson early in the walking away process. They stopped explaining and started building. Building looks different now. It is slower, more deliberate, less performative. Men invest in long-term assets, skills, and routines. They prioritize sustainability over recognition. They value privacy over applause. Privacy is often misunderstood as secrecy. In reality, it is boundary. Men discovered that not everything needs to be shared, justified, or displayed. This discovery protected them from unnecessary conflict and external judgment. With fewer external pressures, men became more internally consistent. Their words aligned with their actions, their plans aligned with their values. This alignment created stability, and stability created confidence. Confidence without exhibition unsettles people. It does not seek validation, it does not compete, it simply exists. That existence challenges narratives that equate worth with visibility. As men became more comfortable outside traditional scripts, intimacy itself began to change. Fewer connections formed, but those that did were more intentional. Men no longer entered relationships to fill a role. They entered them, if at all, to share alignment. That alignment is rare. It requires honesty on both sides. It requires clear boundaries. It requires mutual respect. When alignment is absent, men now walk away early rather than hoping effort will create it. This early exit is often misinterpreted as avoidance. In truth, it is efficiency. Men learned that prolonging misaligned situations only increases cost. Exiting early preserves dignity and peace. Peace remains the central outcome of walking away. Peace is not excitement, it is not intensity, it is not constant stimulation. It is predictability, clarity, and rest. Rest has been undervalued in modern life. Men rediscovered it by removing unnecessary strain. They realized how much of their exhaustion came not from work, but from emotional friction. Reducing friction improved health, sleep improved, focus improved, mood stabilized. These improvements reinforced the decision to disengage from environments that disrupted equilibrium. Equilibrium, once found, becomes non negotiable. Men who have established it will not trade it lightly. This is why surface level appeals fail. They do not address the core benefit men gained. The core benefit was not independence from others, it was independence from chaos. Chaos drains energy. Chaos clouds judgment. Chaos creates instability. Men chose to step out of it. As this choice spreads, cultural expectations must adjust. The idea that men will automatically step into responsibility without reciprocal stability is no longer valid. Responsibility now requires consent. Consent changes everything. It transforms obligation into agreement. It transforms duty into choice. It transforms resentment into cooperation. Where consent exists, connection thrives. Where it does not, withdrawal continues. This reality forces a difficult reckoning. Systems built on assumption must evolve or shrink. Relationships built on entitlement must reform or dissolve. Communities built on pressure must reconfigure or fragment. And fragmentation is often framed negatively, but it can also mean specialization. Smaller, more aligned groups replacing large, unstable ones. Less reach, more depth. Depth matters. Men walking away value depth over breadth. They invest deeply in fewer areas rather than spreading themselves thin. This investment produces resilience. Resilient individuals do not require constant reinforcement. They adapt, they adjust, they persist. Persistence without resentment is a sign of alignment. Men found persistence in solitude because solitude aligned with their needs. This does not mean solitude is permanent for all. It means solitude is no longer feared. When fear disappears, choice becomes genuine. Genuine choice reshapes everything. It removes coercion. It removes guilt as a motivator. It removes obligation as leverage. Leverage shifts toward value. What do you offer that improves peace, stability, and clarity? That is the new calculation. This calculation is not harsh, it is honest. Honesty reduces conflict because expectations are clear. Clear expectations reduce disappointment. Reduced disappointment reduces resentment. Reduced resentment improves interaction. Ironically, walking away may be the first step toward healthier engagement in the long term. It forces recalibration. It removes unsustainable dynamics. It resets standards. Whether those standards are met remains uncertain. What is certain is that men will not lower them simply to restore familiarity. Familiarity is not safety. Men learn that lesson through experience. They will not forget it. As time passes, younger generations will normalize this behavior. They will not remember a time when male participation was assumed. They will grow up seeing autonomy as normal. This normalization will reshape cultural narratives. Stories that rely on old dynamics will lose relevance. New narratives will emerge centered on choice, alignment, and mutual benefit. These narratives will not be uniform. They will vary by culture, community, and individual preference. But the underlying principle will remain. Participation must make sense. Making sense requires transparency. It requires consistency. It requires accountability on all sides. Accountability is often discussed, but rarely practiced evenly. Men walking away responded to uneven accountability by removing themselves from its reach. This removal is not rebellion. It is boundary enforcement. Boundaries protect energy. Protected energy fuels growth. Growth does not announce itself. It accumulates quietly. Quiet accumulation is what we are witnessing now. Men building lives that function without constant negotiation. Men prioritizing stability over validation. Men choosing peace over performance. Performance culture thrives on external approval. Peace culture thrives on internal alignment, and the shift from one to the other marks a profound change in how men relate to the world. This change will continue regardless of opinion. Behavior has already shifted. Outcomes are already visible. Debate lags behind reality. Reality does not require agreement, it only requires acknowledgement. Acknowledgement is the first step toward adaptation. Adaptation is the only viable response. Those who adapt will build sustainable futures. Those who wait for reversal will remain frustrated. This is not a warning, it is an observation. Men walking away did not ask for permission. They did not demand recognition. They simply chose differently. Choice reshaped the landscape. As we reach the end of this discussion, the question is no longer why men left. The question is what comes next. What comes next depends on whether honesty replaces denial, whether adaptation replaces nostalgia, whether value replaces entitlement, and men have already answered for themselves. Now, the rest of society must decide how to respond. Before you go, I want to hear from you. What did you think about what was discussed here? Do you agree with this perspective or do you see it differently? Leave a comment and share your thoughts because these conversations matter. And like the video, if you like it, don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.